For 60-year-old Elaine Porter, life in Parma, a quiet suburb outside Cleveland, had settled into a stillness so complete it felt like dust gathering in the corners of a room no one dared to enter. For decades, she had moved through the same narrow routines inside the same house, a modest single-family home built in the late 70s, with beige siding and windows that stuck in the winter. Neighbors walked their dogs, children rode bikes past her driveway. But inside those walls, time did not move. It pressed down. Her husband, 62-year-old Victor Porter, had long ago shaped the rhythm of the household into something that resembled order but felt more like captivity. He managed every checking account, every credit card, every receipt from every grocery run. He held the car keys and decided when Elaine could use the Honda parked neatly in the driveway. Even the thermostat, set at exactly 72, belonged to him. Victor believed in knowing where things stood. And over the years, the belief hardened into a power no one questioned, least of all Elaine. She had not always been quiet. As a young woman, she laughed easily, filled rooms with warmth, dreamed about traveling. But 40 years of walking on shifting ground had taught her to step lightly, speak softly, think inside boundaries he approved of. Each small correction, "Don't do it like that, I'll handle the money, you don't need to go anywhere today," wore down her edges. What remained was someone who moved carefully, breathed carefully, existed carefully. The house reflected Victor's preferences in every room. The leather recliner angled toward the television, the framed prints of Lake Erie lighthouses he collected, the kitchen drawers arranged exactly the way he liked them. Elaine lived there, but it never felt like it belonged to her. She cooked in a kitchen she did not organize, slept in a bedroom where she lay awake listening to Victor's snoring, folded laundry she never chose, scrubbed floors she rarely walked across without permission. She did not realize how small her world had become until she tried to imagine a day without instructions. Her inner landscape had grown quiet over the years, not peaceful, but muted, like a radio left on low volume. Fear settled in places joy once lived. Not the sharp kind that makes the heart race, but the steady kind that teaches the body to stay small. Her memories felt distant, blurred at the edges, as if she had been watching someone else's life unfold instead of living her own. Lately she found herself staring at the wall while the morning news played, unable to recall what day it was, what year certain things had happened, or when she had last made a decision without second-guessing whether Victor would approve. But cracks had started forming in that stillness. Elaine felt them in small tremors, a moment of irritation when Victor dismissed her, a flicker of yearning when she saw other women her age laughing together outside the grocery store, a strange heaviness in her chest when she woke each morning wishing the day could be different. And then came the afternoon that shifted everything. The moment standing in her driveway when her daughter Sarah looked at her, not with pity, but with fierce, urgent worry. That moment had been rising toward her for years, and though Elaine did not know it yet, nothing in her life would stay silent after it arrived. The confrontation began the moment Sarah pulled into the driveway, her car door slamming shut with a force that made Elaine flinch. The late afternoon sun cast long lines across the pavement, and for a moment Elaine looked like a woman caught in a spotlight she had spent decades avoiding. Sarah didn't walk, she marched, her expression a mix of anger, fear, and something fiercer than both. Elaine had just stepped outside to throw away a bag of trash when Victor's voice echoed from the living room window, criticizing her for taking too long, for doing it wrong, for something so small it barely had a name. Sarah heard every word while still halfway out of her car. "Mom, don't go back in there." Her voice cut through the air, sharp, breathless, almost shaking. Elaine froze. "Sarah, honey, it's fine. It's just—" No, Sarah stepped closer, placing herself between her mother and the front door. "I'm not doing this again. I'm not letting you walk back into that house like everything's normal." Elaine's breath hitched. Panic rose fast, familiar, instinctive. I can't just leave. Where would I go? I don't have money. I don't have anything. And he controls everything. I know, Sarah said, her voice softening but not losing its intensity. I've watched it my entire life. The way he talks to you, the way you shrink when he steps into a room, the way he holds your whole life in his hands. It's more complicated than that, Elaine whispered. No, Mom. It's exactly that. Sarah's jaw tightened. You're not going back inside. Elaine looked toward the window. She imagined Victor standing just behind the blinds, watching, calculating. He'd want to know why she was outside so long. He'd want to know every detail of this conversation. The thought alone made Elaine's stomach twist. I can't leave, she said, shaking her head. I don't have my documents. I don't have a plan. If I walk away right now, he'll come after me. You don't know what he'll do. Sarah reached for her mother's hands, cold, trembling. Then give me something. Something real. You can't live like this anymore. I won't let you. Elaine felt the pressure of her daughter's grip, the urgency, the fear wrapped in love. She wanted to believe she had choices, but choices felt like stories other women told. 2 weeks, Sarah said, her eyes locking onto hers. You plan. You think. You figure out what you need. And in 2 weeks, you walk out of this house with me. I will help you, but you have to promise me you'll try. Elaine wanted to refuse, to say it was impossible, but something in Sarah's face, a mixture of desperation and hope, pinned her in place. 2 weeks, Elaine whispered. I'll try. Sarah pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if trying to keep her from fading. After a long moment, she stepped back, wiped her eyes, and climbed into her car. Elaine watched the taillights disappear down the quiet suburban street, then slowly turned toward the house. Its beige siding and drawn curtains seemed to close in on her, familiar and suffocating. 40 years. 40 years inside a home that had never felt like hers. She stood there a long time, staring at the place she now understood was not a home at all, only a prison she had survived one day at a time. That night, the house settled into its usual silence, the kind that always felt heavier once the lights were off. Elaine lay stiffly on her side of the bed, her hands folded under her cheek, staring into the darkness. Beside her, Victor had already fallen into his familiar rhythm of sleep, loud. Uneven snores that rattled from deep in his chest. The sound filled the room the way his presence filled her life. Inescapable, consuming, leaving little space for her own thoughts to breathe. But tonight, something was different. Sarah's words echoed in her mind, sharper than the quiet that surrounded her. 2 weeks. The number pulsed through her like a heartbeat. It was the first real measure of time she'd held for herself in decades. Not a deadline assigned by Victor, not a schedule shaped around errands or chores. It belonged to her. The thought was almost frightening. Elaine stared at the ceiling, barely blinking. For 40 years, she had never planned anything for herself, not even small things. Vacations, finances, appointments, holidays, every decision had passed through Victor first. She followed. She adapted. She survived. But she had never, not once, created a plan that began and ended with her own needs. Her pulse quickened. Her breath came shallow. But beneath the fear, beneath the trembling in her chest, something else stirred. Small, faint, almost unfamiliar. Resolve. She swallowed hard and forced herself to think through the fog of panic. If she truly meant to leave in 2 weeks, then she needed 3 things. Only 3. And each one felt enormous. Money. Her heart thudded painfully at the word. Victor managed every dollar, every receipt, every purchase. She couldn't withdraw from their joint account without him seeing. She couldn't use the credit card he checked nightly. But she would need cash, real cash. Enough to get her through the first days after leaving. Enough to not be a burden to Sarah. enough to feel like she had agency. Documents: her birth certificate, their marriage license, her social security card, insurance information, medical records. Victor kept all of it in the locked filing cabinet in his office room. She knew the files existed. She just hadn't touched them in over 20 years. She would need copies, photographs, anything she could take without alerting him. Opportunity. She looked at Victor's shadowed silhouette beside her, the rise and fall of his chest, the snoring, the unpredictable temper just beneath the surface. She would need one perfect moment when he was out of the house long enough for her to move, long enough to gather what she needed without him walking in and demanding to know what she was doing. A tremor ran through her. Leaving him was terrifying, not because she loved him, but because she had forgotten what life outside these walls even looked like. Yet, even as fear wrapped itself around her ribs, the flicker of resolve remained. For the first time in decades, Elaine Porter was planning something for herself, and she knew there was no turning back. The next morning, Elaine woke with a sense of heaviness she could feel in her bones. Planning was one thing, acting was another, and her first task, finding money, felt like stepping into a battlefield she had never trained for. The financial world of the Porter household had always belonged to Victor. Every dollar earned, spent, or saved passed through him like water through a filter. Nothing moved without his approval. They shared a joint bank account at a local credit union, but joint meant only one thing. Victor had access. Victor watched every statement, every pending charge, every electronic alert. He checked their online banking each night as faithfully as he took his blood pressure medication. It wasn't curiosity, it was surveillance, wrapped in the insistence that he was just keeping things organized. Elaine stood in the kitchen that morning, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the quiet room, staring at the grocery list he had given her. She knew what she had to do. She felt sick to her stomach thinking about it, but the thought of doing nothing, of letting the 2 weeks slip away, felt worse. At the grocery store, she walked the aisles slowly, choosing items Victor expected her to buy. Bread, eggs, butter, canned soup, chicken thighs. She paid with their usual debit card, the one he would see on the bank statement. Everything had to look normal. Then, after loading the bags into the trunk, she returned inside. Her palms were sweating. Her heart raced, but she walked back to customer service with purposeful steps. "I'm so sorry," she said softly to the clerk, holding up a bag of groceries. "I grabbed the wrong items. Could I return these? I'll just take the refund in cash." The clerk didn't think twice. Many shoppers returned items. It was mundane, ordinary. To Elaine, it felt like theft. The cash, just a few small bills, felt heavier than it should have. She folded it carefully and slipped it deep inside her purse, making sure it wouldn't flutter out when she opened it later. When she reached the car, she sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, breathing hard, the echo of Victor's imagined voice filling her head. If he found out, the consequences would be severe, not violent, but punishing in ways that left no marks, yet lasted for years. But she also felt something else, a jolt of strength, a new current running beneath her fear. The next day she returned another item, and then another, just a few dollars at a time. Always cash, always hidden. Slowly, steadily, her secret fund grew. $10, $20, $30, never more than Victor would notice, missing from weekly bills, but enough to matter. Each time she came home, she went straight to the bathroom. She opened the drawer beneath the sink, lifted the half-empty box of tampons Victor never touched, and slipped the bills inside. It became her vault, her small rebellion. Every deposit felt dangerous, but every deposit also felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. By the end of the first week, she had collected nearly $80, a modest sum, but to Elaine it felt monumental, a sign that her plan, fragile, terrifying, was becoming real. In that tiny bathroom, with a mirror reflecting a woman she barely recognized, Elaine realized something she had not felt in decades. She was no longer only surviving. She was beginning to move. Over the next several days, Elaine moved through the house with a heightened awareness, as if seeing her life from above for the very first time. Nothing in Victor's behavior had changed. What changed was the way she watched him. She paid attention not as a wife trying to avoid conflict, but as a woman quietly gathering information, memorizing the shape of her cage in order to find its only unlocked door. Victor lived by predictable habits, the kind that never varied from one day to the next. His mornings always began the same way. The television switched on at 6:45, tuned to the morning news before he even brewed his coffee. Elaine could set a clock by the moment he cleared his throat during the weather report. He sat in his recliner, slippers angled the same way every morning, and expected breakfast at 8 sharp. After work, he followed the same script. Shoes off at the door, mail sorted at the kitchen table, complaints about traffic on I-480. A single beer after dinner, never two, never skipped, then an hour of television, usually documentaries about World War II or Cleveland sports talk radio. He spoke to Elaine only to correct something or to comment about the news. Bedtime came at exactly 10. He brushed his teeth for 30 seconds, used the same mouthwash, placed his watch on the nightstand, and slid under the blanket with the same heavy sigh. Within minutes, he was asleep, snoring steadily, his breathing deep and oblivious. Elaine watched every pattern, every detail, each small ritual. She wasn't surprised by his predictability. She had lived inside it for 40 years, but she was surprised by how clearly she could map it now. She saw his routines not as habits, but as openings and closures, as guardrails, as locks, and she needed to find the one moment each week when the lock turned. It happened during his medical checkup. Victor had a standing appointment every Tuesday morning at a clinic in Parma Heights. He went for routine blood pressure monitoring and a cholesterol check every few months, but he always left the house at the same time, 9:30. He always shaved that morning. He always wore the same jacket. And most importantly, he always insisted on going alone. Victor hated having anyone accompany him to medical appointments. It threatened the image he had built of himself as capable and in control. He would never allow Elaine to sit beside him in a waiting room, which meant one thing. For exactly 90 minutes, every Tuesday, the house was hers. She realized it suddenly one evening as he followed his bedtime routine, his actions unfolding like clockwork. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the window she had been waiting for, the only time she could access the filing cabinet without interruption, without suspicion, without him breathing down her neck. As Victor turned off the light and settled into sleep, Elaine stared into the darkness, her eyes wide open. For the first time, she saw a way out, and she knew exactly when she would take it. Tuesday arrived with a gray Cleveland sky hanging low over the neighborhood, the kind of morning that made everything feel heavier. Elaine moved quietly through the kitchen, her hands cold despite the warmth of the room. Victor was finishing his second cup of coffee, reading the same local newspaper he read every Tuesday, checking his watch every few minutes, out of habit. "Appointment at 10, he muttered, mostly to himself. Elaine nodded, careful to keep her face blank. She had spent the entire night awake, rehearsing her steps over and over again until they blurred into one trembling, endless loop. 90 minutes. That was all she would have. 90 minutes to do something she had not dared even imagine for decades. Victor left at exactly 9:30, just as he always did. The door shut behind him with a soft thud, and for a long moment Elaine stood motionless in the kitchen, listening to the fading sound of his car pulling away. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought the whole house could hear it. When the street grew quiet again, she moved. Her feet carried her down the hall, almost on instinct, though every step felt like walking through water. Victor's small office, really more of a storage room filled with organized stacks of papers, sat at the end of the hall. She pushed open the door slowly, half expecting him to suddenly appear behind her. Nothing. Just silence. She stepped inside and stared at the metal filing cabinet shoved under the window. She had seen Victor open it hundreds of times, always with a small key he kept on his keyring. But she also knew something he didn't realize she remembered. Years ago, after one of his appointments, he had forgotten to lock it. She had seen it then. The latch didn't fully engage unless pressed hard. With shaking fingers, she grasped the handle, braced her palm against the cold metal, and pushed firmly upward. A soft click. The cabinet opened. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled so violently she had to steady herself against the desk before reaching inside. The folders were arranged with immaculate precision, exactly the way Victor liked everything. She recognized her birth certificate immediately, a slightly yellowed document inside a protective sleeve. Her Social Security card sat in the next folder, tucked inside a small envelope. Their marriage certificate, stiff and faded at the edges, was in another file. And finally, the property deed, the document that confirmed ownership of the house she had lived in but never truly belonged to. She did not take anything. She didn't dare. Instead, she pulled her phone from her pocket and began photographing each page, one by one, making sure every word, every seal, every signature was clear. Her hands shook so badly the first few shots came out blurry. She forced herself to breathe, slow, controlled, shallow, and tried again. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every gust of wind outside felt like footsteps on the porch. By the time she finished, her palms were slick with sweat. Carefully, meticulously, she returned each document to its exact place. She smoothed the folders, closed the drawer, pressed up until she heard the latch catch, and wiped the metal surface with her sleeve to remove any smudges. Then she stepped back, chest heaving, knees weak. Her entire body felt electrified, as if adrenaline were the only thing keeping her upright. Elaine left the office on unsteady legs and stood in the hallway, listening to the empty house. Her heart was still racing, but beneath the terror pulsed something stronger. She had done it, for the first time in 40 years. Victor Porter wasn't the only one who knew where her life was kept. Elaine waited until late evening. When the house had slipped into its usual hush and Victor sat in the living room watching a documentary, his attention fixed on the television, she moved quietly down the hallway, her steps light, her breath controlled, as if any sudden movement might disturb the fragile layer of invisibility she relied on. In the bedroom closet sat a stack of old suitcases, large ones they used on the rare vacations Victor planned, bulky ones he favored because they could hold everything he insisted they bring. Elaine didn't touch those. Instead, she reached for the smallest suitcase they owned, a worn navy blue carry-on with a loose zipper tab. It was the only one she could fill without him noticing it missing, and it was the only one she could carry quickly if she had to leave in a hurry. She set it on the bed with trembling hands. Packing for a new life should have felt liberating, but for Elaine, it felt like dismantling the last pieces of herself she had managed to protect. She opened her dresser drawers with care, sliding out only the most basic clothes: 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, a nightgown, underwear, socks. Nothing bright, nothing new. Nothing he might remember her wearing recently. She folded each item quickly and placed them neatly inside the suitcase. Next came her medications, blood pressure pills, the low-dose aspirin her doctor insisted she take, a small container for her diabetes tests. She placed them carefully into a zippered pouch. These were not luxuries, they were survival. In the bathroom, she gathered only the essentials: a travel-sized bottle of shampoo, a toothbrush, toothpaste, a hairbrush, her small container of face cream. She paused for a moment, looking at herself in the mirror. Her reflection felt like a stranger, tired eyes, shoulders pulled in. mouth pressed into a thin line. She didn't recognize this woman, yet she was the one who had endured everything. When she returned to the bedroom, the suitcase looked almost too empty, as if it needed something more, something that belonged to her, not just items of necessity. So Elaine began walking through the house, moving as though in a trance. The living room, with its heavy furniture and carefully arranged lighthouse prints, felt foreign. The kitchen, where she had prepared thousands of meals in silence, felt hollow. The hallway photos showed decades of family moments, but she felt strangely disconnected from all of them. 40 years. 40 years spent inside a life shaped by someone else's choices. The walls held memories, but none of them truly felt like hers. She drifted back into the bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside lay a handful of old keepsakes, most untouched for years. On top was a folded cream-colored sweater, soft, hand-knitted, slightly frayed at the sleeves. Her grandmother had given it to her when she was 19, before she married Victor, back when her life had still felt open, full of possibilities. Elaine lifted the sweater gently, her fingertips brushing the textured wool. For the first time in years, emotion broke through her numbness, something tender, aching, almost painful. This sweater was a piece of who she used to be, who she might still become. She folded it carefully and placed it inside the suitcase, resting her hand on top of the fabric for a long moment. In that quiet room, with the house humming faintly around her, she felt something shift. Not freedom, not yet, but a beginning. The night before her planned escape, the house felt strangely still, as if holding its breath. Elaine moved through each room one last time, not to reminisce, but to confirm, to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything, hadn't left a trace of her intentions. The quiet pressed against her, thick and familiar, but for the first time it didn't reach her. She expected to feel something, nostalgia, sorrow, even fear, but what settled in her wasn't emotion. It was absence. There was no tenderness in these rooms, no warmth in the corners, no ache for what she was leaving behind. The life she had lived here seemed like a series of scenes from someone else's story, faint and distant, drained of color. It wasn't detachment born from healing. It was numbness formed from too many years of being small, silent, and unseen. Elaine touched the kitchen counter, the one she had cleaned thousands of times. Nothing stirred in her. No memories pushed up from the surface. She looked at the living room sofa where she had sat folding laundry while Victor complained about her being too slow. Still nothing. Even the bedroom, where she had spent countless nights holding her breath as Victor's moods shifted unpredictably, felt more like a set piece than a place she lived. She had expected the weight of 40 years. Instead, there was only stillness. In the center of the kitchen table sat a heavy glass salt shaker. Victor had once grabbed it during an argument, furious over something as trivial as a misplaced receipt, and slammed it down with enough force to chip the wooden surface. The mark remained, a reminder, a warning. Elaine reached slowly into the drawer beside the fridge and pulled out a small notepad. The paper felt thin between her fingers. Her handwriting looked unsteady as she wrote the words she'd rehearsed silently for days. I'm leaving. Don't look for me. No explanation. No apology. No space for negotiation. Just an ending. She tore the note carefully, folded it once, and placed it on the kitchen table. Her hand hovered for a moment before sliding the salt shaker on top of it, anchoring the message with the very object that symbolized everything she was walking away from. The gesture was quiet, but it felt final. She stepped back and stood still, staring at the table, letting the reality settle around her. There was no fear now, not even grief, only determination, a steady, grounded certainty that this house, this life, this version of herself had already ended. When she turned off the kitchen light, she didn't look back. There was nothing left here to look back for. Elaine walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, the suitcase already packed, her plan already in motion. In the darkness, as she lay down beside Victor for the last time, she felt the numbness again. But beneath it, quiet, steady waiting was resolve. Morning would come, and she would be gone. Morning crept into the house, slowly, gray and heavy, the kind of dawn that blurred the line between night and day. Elaine sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her packed suitcase waiting by the closet. Victor was still sleeping, oblivious, his steady snoring vibrating through the mattress. Every sound in the house felt sharper, every creak, every shift of air, as if the walls themselves could betray her. Her hands shook so violently she had to hold them together. It was time. She knew it, but her body felt frozen, locked in place by years of fear. The phone in her pocket felt impossibly heavy. Finally, with a breath that trembled on the way out, she stood and stepped into the hallway. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She moved through the house with the silent precision of someone who had rehearsed each step 1,000 times. Through the living room, past the blinds, past the note under the salt shaker, to the front door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock. She stepped outside. The cold morning air hit her face, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone steady. She pressed the screen, missed the number, tried again. The third attempt finally connected. Sarah. Elaine's voice cracked. Mom. Sarah's voice came through immediately, alert, urgent, breathless. Are you okay? I can't. My hands are shaking. I can't. I'm already on my way, Sarah said, not letting her finish. I left 10 minutes ago. Just walk out. Don't wait. Don't think. Just go to the driveway. I'm coming. Elaine swallowed a sob of relief. Okay. She ended the call and stood, unsteady, on the porch. The suitcase handle felt slick in her grip. Every instinct told her to go back inside, to avoid Victor's anger, his questions, his punishments. But the note on the kitchen table was already written. The life she had lived was already over. She forced herself down the steps, one trembling foot at a time. Her heart hammered so violently it hurt. The air felt thin. She imagined Victor waking up, calling for her, realizing she was gone. She could almost hear his footsteps behind her, though the house remained silent. The fear pushed her forward faster. She reached the driveway, then the sidewalk, then the street corner, and then she saw it, a car turning onto the block, moving quickly but carefully. Sarah's car, the same one that had brought her home so many times. But today it felt like a lifeline. The car stopped beside her, and the passenger door flew open. Mom, get in. Elaine slid into the seat, breathless, heart pounding, her hand still shaking uncontrollably. Sarah reached over and closed the door firmly, her eyes shining with worry and fierce determination. As the car pulled away from the house, Elaine didn't look back. She couldn't. She wouldn't. For the first time in 40 years, she was leaving that house behind, not in fear but in motion. And the silence that followed wasn't the silence of oppression. It was the silence of escape. 6 months passed, and the sharp terror of Elaine's escape softened into something quieter, steadier, though not always easier. She now lived in a modest, one-bedroom apartment in Lakewood, on a street lined with old maples that turned golden in the fall. The building was older, the walls thin. The rent manageable, but tight. Nothing about the space was remarkable. Yet every time Elaine locked the door behind her, she felt something she had never known in her adult life. Safety. The apartment smelled faintly of old books and lavender detergent. The furniture was mismatched, pieces donated by neighbors, friends of Sarah, and a few items she found secondhand. Her bed was softer than the one she used to sleep in, though smaller. Near the window stood a small table where she ate simple meals and read in the evenings. It wasn't much, but it felt like hers. For the first time in decades, all of it was hers. Elaine worked part-time at a used bookstore on Detroit Avenue. A quiet little shop with creaking floors and shelves arranged in gentle disorder. She spent her days sorting donated books, dusting old hardcovers, chatting softly with locals who came in looking for something comforting or nostalgic. The pay wasn't much, but it covered most of her rent, and the work soothed her. Books didn't raise their voices. Books didn't demand explanations. Books didn't punish her for taking up space. Financially, things were still difficult. Some months she scraped by with barely enough for groceries. She learned to stretch food, to find discounts, to accept help when Sarah quietly filled her pantry with canned soup or slipped a $20 bill into her coat pocket by accident. Elaine hated depending on anyone, yet she also knew this reliance was temporary, just another step toward something steadier. Loneliness visited her sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening. When the bookstore had closed and the street outside fell still, she felt the unfamiliar ache of empty rooms. She had never lived alone before. She had never heard her own breathing fill a space. The solitude could sting, but it never frightened her. At night, she slept deeply, no sudden footsteps, no tension coiled in her spine, no voice barking her name from the hallway. Her dreams were still unsettled sometimes, echoes of a life she had finally left behind. But the mornings brought peace. She breathed without permission now, without someone monitoring her every movement. Some days were difficult. Some days she questioned whether she was strong enough to rebuild everything from nothing. Some days she woke with the old memories pressing against her ribs like bruises. But all of it, every fear, every struggle, every lonely morning, was worth it. Because this life, fragile as it was, belonged to her. Every choice, every hour, every step forward was one she made freely. She no longer existed in someone else's shadow. She no longer measured her worth by someone else's approval. In Lakewood, in a small apartment with creaking floors and mismatched furniture, Elaine lived a life that was imperfect, but finally, beautifully her own. In the months that followed, Elaine found herself reflecting not only on the life she had escaped, but on the women she had met in quiet corners of the bookstore, women whose eyes carried stories they never fully spoke aloud. Some were older, some younger, all moving through their days with a tentative strength that felt painfully familiar. She didn't know how her story would find its way to anyone else, but she knew that if even one woman heard it, truly heard it, then the 40 years she had survived wouldn't sit silent in the dark anymore. Sometimes, late at night, Elaine would sit at her small kitchen table, tea cooling beside her, and speak softly into the stillness as if someone were sitting across from her. Someone who needed to hear the words she herself had once needed. She spoke not as a victim, but as someone who had finally stepped back into her own life. If you're sitting somewhere wondering whether what you're living is normal, she would say quietly, it probably isn't. Her voice held no bitterness, only compassion. And if you're asking yourself whether you deserve better, you do. You always have. The lessons she had carried with her were simple, but hard-won. Love does not bruise, not the body, not the spirit, not the voice inside you that whispers who you are. Anyone who tells you otherwise, she murmured into the quiet, doesn't understand love. They understand control, and control is not the same thing. She would fold her hands around the warm mug, breathing in the steam, remembering all the years she believed fear was normal because it arrived in small, daily doses, too subtle to define, but powerful enough to shape a life. Courage, she said softly, isn't being unafraid. Courage is doing what's right despite fear. It's shaking hands, pounding heart, and still taking that step forward. There were nights she still woke up from dreams of the old house, its walls closing in like they used to. But each time she opened her eyes, she saw the moonlight on her own ceiling, heard the hum of her own refrigerator, felt the gentleness of a space untouched by anger or control. She let those moments remind her of how far she had come. "You deserve safety," she would whisper, "and respect and freedom. Not someday. Not if you earn it. Not only when someone else decides you're worthy of it." She paused then, letting the silence settle. "You deserve it simply because you exist." Elaine hadn't imagined starting over at 63. She hadn't imagined learning how to pay bills on her own, how to navigate loneliness, how to build a life from pieces she didn't know were still hers. But she had discovered something in the process, something she wished she could hand gently to every woman who had ever felt trapped. It's never too late to begin again. Her eyes often softened then, filled with a quiet hope that warmed the small room. And if your hands are shaking and your voice is breaking, and you don't know how you'll survive the next hour, take the step anyway. Someone will meet you on the other side. Maybe a daughter, maybe a friend, maybe someone you haven't met yet. She lifted her chin slightly, as if looking directly at the unseen listener. "I stepped toward freedom at 63, and you can too."